Martha Williams Saturday on the antique rocking chair that had belonged to her mother-in-law, gazing out the bay window at the magnolia trees that lined the driveway of the estate she now called home, the sprawling Victorian house in Savannah, Georgia, with its wraparound porch and carefully maintained gardens, had been in her husband Richard's family for 3 generations. But now, at 62 years old, Martha found herself the sole inheritor of the Williams family fortune, a twist of fate she had never anticipated. 6 months ago, her beloved husband Richard had passed away suddenly from a heart attack at the age of 65. Their 40 years of marriage had been blessed with 2 wonderful children, James, now 38 and working as a successful corporate attorney in Atlanta, and Eliza, 35, who had followed her passion for teaching and worked at the local elementary school. The Williams family had always been close-knit. Richard had built a successful law practice, specializing in estate planning, and Martha had supported him through every step of his career while raising their children. They had created a warm home filled with love, laughter, and traditions. But there was one person who had never quite fit into this family portrait: Rebecca, James's wife of 12 years. From the moment James had introduced Rebecca to the family, Martha had sensed something off about her daughter-in-law. Rebecca was strikingly beautiful, tall with auburn hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they surveyed. She worked in marketing for a luxury brand, but frequently changed positions, always chasing a higher salary or more prestigious title. "She's ambitious," James would say defensively, whenever Martha expressed concern about Rebecca's frequent job hopping. "That's what I love about her." Martha tried to accept his explanation. After all, she had always taught her children to see the good in others. But over the years, Rebecca's true character had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Rebecca rarely attended family gatherings, and when she did, she spent most of her time on her phone or making cutting remarks about the quaintness of their family traditions. She had openly told James she had no interest in having children, which broke Martha's heart, as she had always longed for grandchildren. But what disturbed Martha the most was how Rebecca seemed to look at Richard's success and property with hungry eyes, asking pointed questions about the family's finances that made even the unflappable Richard uncomfortable. "Nah, that's just not something we discuss at the dinner table," Richard would say firmly, changing the subject whenever Rebecca brought up his law firm's profits or the value of their historic home. When Richard died suddenly, Martha's world crumbled. The weeks after his funeral passed in a blur of grief. James temporarily moved back to Savannah to help his mother settle affairs, while Eliza took a leave of absence from teaching to provide emotional support. The siblings took turns accompanying Martha to meetings with the family lawyer, Harold Peterson, who had been Richard's closest friend since law school. It was during one of these meetings that Martha first noticed Rebecca's sudden interest in family matters. Though she had claimed to be too busy with work to attend the funeral, Rebecca appeared at Harold's office the day they were scheduled to read Richard's will, dressed in a sleek black suit that looked more appropriate for a business meeting than a grieving family gathering. "I'm here to support James, of course," Rebecca had said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. Harold, who had known the Williams family for decades, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he invited everyone to sit. Richard was meticulous in his planning. Harold began, adjusting his reading glasses. As an estate attorney himself, he wanted to ensure everything was in order for his family. Martha sat quietly as Harold outlined the provisions of the will. The family home and the majority of Richard's assets would go to Martha, with trusts established for James and Eliza that would provide them with a steady income while preserving the principal. Richard's law firm would continue operating under the management of his trusted partners, with profits shared among them and a percentage going to Martha as the majority stakeholder. As Harold spoke, Martha noticed Rebecca's posture growing increasingly rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer handbag. "And what about James's share? As Richard's son and only male heir, surely he should inherit the firm and the family home," Rebecca interrupted, her voice sharp. Harold peered at Rebecca over his glasses. Richard believed in equality between his children. Both James and Eliza will receive identical trusts. The home and firm management will remain with Martha during her lifetime, and then be divided equally between the siblings according to the terms I've outlined. That's absurd, Rebecca snapped. James is a lawyer. He should take over the practice, and we should be allowed to move into the family home. It's far too large for just Martha. The room fell silent. Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs, but before she could respond, James placed a hand over his wife's. Rebecca, please, he said quietly. This isn't the time or place. Dad made his wishes clear, and we all respect that. Rebecca yanked her hand away and stood up. Well, I don't. We've been waiting for years, putting up with your father's old-fashioned ways. And now we're supposed to just sit back while your mother controls everything. It's not fair. Waiting for what exactly? Eliza asked, her voice dangerously calm. Rebecca realized her mistake too late. Her face flushed as she looked around the room at the shocked expressions. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, the door slamming behind her. I'm so sorry, James whispered, looking mortified. She's just upset about Dad. We all are. She didn't mean it. But Martha knew better. The mask had slipped, revealing what she had suspected. All along, Rebecca had married James with an eye on the Williams fortune. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca launched a campaign to convince James to contest the will. Martha overheard heated arguments between them when they thought she wasn't listening. Your father wasn't thinking clearly at the end, Rebecca insisted. We deserve more than just a trust. This is our opportunity to really build something. Think about who could sell that old house, take over the firm, and finally move to Manhattan like we've always talked about. Martha's heart broke as she listened. She had always known that Rebecca wasn't the right match for her kind-hearted son, but she had kept her peace for James's sake. Now, she worried that Rebecca might actually convince him to turn against his own family. But James, who had always admired his father's integrity, stood firm. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He told Rebecca, I won't contest his will. It would dishonor everything he stood for. This principled stance only fueled Rebecca's resentment. She began spreading rumors in their social circle that Martha was manipulating her children and had somehow coerced Richard into cutting James out of his rightful inheritance. She stopped coming to family dinners altogether and pointedly refused to help when Martha fell ill with pneumonia shortly after Richard's death. The situation came to a head 3 months after the funeral. Martha had invited both her children and their partners for Sunday dinner, a tradition she was determined to maintain despite her grief. Eliza and her husband David arrived promptly, bringing a homemade peach cobbler for dessert. James came alone. Rebecca couldn't make it, he said, his expression strained. Work emergency. They all knew it was an excuse, but no one called him on it. Instead, they tried to enjoy their meal, reminiscing about Richard and sharing stories that made them laugh through their tears. As they were clearing the dishes, Martha's phone rang. It was Harold. Martha, I apologize for disturbing your Sunday, but there's something you need to know, he said gravely. Rebecca came to my office on Friday demanding to see Richard's original will. When my secretary stepped away for a moment, Rebecca attempted to access our file room. We have security cameras. Martha, she was trying to find and possibly destroy documents. Martha's hand trembled as she set down the phone. James, she called softly. We need to talk. She shared what Harold had told her, watching as her son's face crumpled in disbelief and then hardened with resolve. I'll handle this, he said, his voice firm. That evening, James confronted Rebecca with what he had learned. The argument that ensued was explosive. Rebecca finally dropped all pretense, admitting that she had only stayed in their marriage because she believed James would eventually inherit a substantial fortune. I've wasted 12 years of my life in this backwater town, playing the dutiful wife to a man who can't even stand up to his mother, she shouted. I could have married anyone Simeon rich enough to give me the life I deserve without waiting for his parents to die. The cruel words were the final straw. The next day, James moved back to his childhood home and filed for a divorce. The divorce proceedings revealed even more about Rebecca's character. Financial investigations showed she had been secretly accruing massive debt, mashing out credit cards, in anticipation of paying them off with James's inheritance. She had also been having an affair with a wealthy client from her firm for the past 3 years. Despite Rebecca's attempts to claim half of James's trust fund and a portion of his future inheritance, her case was weakened by a prenuptial agreement that Richard had insisted upon, another example of his foresight that now protected the family. The divorce was finalized with Rebecca receiving only what she had brought into the marriage, which amounted to very little. The experience was painful for the entire family, but especially for James, who had genuinely loved his wife despite her flaws. After the divorce, he threw himself into work, taking a sabbatical from his corporate job to help manage his father's firm alongside the partners. 1 year after Richard's death, Martha invited Harold and the law firm staff to the family home for a memorial dinner. As they gathered in the garden where Richard had loved to tend his roses, Martha raised a glass in toast to Richard, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, who gave us not only his love but his wisdom. He protected this family in life and continues to do so even now. James stood beside his mother, his arm around her shoulders. The past year had aged him, silver now threading through his dark hair, but there was a peace in his eyes that had been missing during his marriage. "I've been thinking, Mom," he said as the guests mingled. "Dad always wanted to establish a scholarship fund for aspiring estate attorneys. I'd like to use part of my trust to make that happen in his name." Martha squeezed his hand. "He would be so proud of you." Across the garden, Eliza approached with big news of her own. She and David were expecting their first Judah boy they planned to name Richard. As Martha embraced her daughter, joy mingling with her tears, she felt Richard's presence all around them. Despite Rebecca's attempts to divide them, the Williams family had emerged stronger, bound by love and the legacy of a man who had protected them even from being. 2 years later, Martha stood on the porch of the family home, watching her grandson toddle across the lawn, chased by his doting father and uncle. The law firm was thriving under James's part-time guidance, and he had recently started dating Sarah, a kind-hearted pediatrician who had moved to town. The Williams family had weathered their storm, and while Martha still missed Richard every day, she found comfort in knowing that his careful planning had preserved not just their material legacy, but the values that truly mattered: integrity, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds of family love. As for Rebecca, they rarely spoke of her. The last they had heard, she had moved to Chicago and married a much older businessman, ironically, a client of Richard's firm who had never updated his estate plan. Some lessons, it seemed, were never learned. Martha smiled as James scooped up little Richie, swinging him high in the air as the child's laughter echoed across the garden. This was Richard's true legacy, not the house or the money or the firm, but the family that continued to grow and thrive in the fertile soil of his love.